In this episode, we're going to zoom in on client-side attacks, which are attacks that target the devices and applications people use directly, like browsers, email clients, document viewers, and everyday endpoints. When beginners think about security threats, they often picture servers in a data center or a cloud service being hacked from the outside. Client-side attacks flip that perspective by focusing on the user's side of the connection, because that is where trust decisions are made and where a single click can open a path into an environment. Leaders must anticipate these attacks because they scale, they evolve quickly, and they exploit ordinary work habits such as reading email, opening attachments, browsing web pages, and installing updates. Even in organizations with strong perimeter defenses, client-side weaknesses can bypass those defenses by turning a user's device into the attacker's entry point. By the end, you should have a clear mental model of what client-side attacks are, why they are so effective, and what categories of prevention and detection leaders should prioritize to reduce real incident risk. A useful way to understand client-side attacks is to view the client as the front door of modern work, because nearly every business process begins with a user interacting with software. The client can be a laptop, a phone, a tablet, or even a virtual desktop, but the key is that it is where data is displayed, where credentials are typed, and where decisions are made under time pressure. Client-side attacks take advantage of this by focusing on the parts of the system that are hardest to standardize: human behavior, diverse software versions, and constant exposure to untrusted content. A client consumes information from outside the organization every day, such as web pages, messages, files, and links, which means it is constantly parsing and rendering content that may be hostile. That content can exploit a software flaw, trick the user, or quietly manipulate what the user sees. Leaders need to treat the client as a primary security boundary, not an afterthought, because attackers prefer paths that are inexpensive, repeatable, and likely to succeed. A client-side compromise can lead to credential theft, lateral movement, data exposure, and long-lived persistence that is difficult to detect if you are not looking for it. One major category of client-side attack is phishing and related social engineering, because it targets the person rather than the code, and it often succeeds even when systems are technically well configured. Phishing is the attempt to trick someone into revealing credentials, approving a transaction, installing software, or taking an action that benefits the attacker. Leaders must anticipate phishing because it adapts to every new control, using more convincing messages, better impersonation, and more targeted timing. A beginner misconception is that phishing is always obvious, like a badly written email, but modern attacks can use accurate branding, realistic context, and urgent language that matches a person's role. Client-side risk rises when a single action, such as entering a password into a fake login page, grants access to valuable systems. This is why multi-factor authentication, MFA, is so important, but leaders should also understand that phishing can target the second factor and can exploit approval fatigue, where users click approve without thinking. Preventing phishing is not only a training problem, it is also an access design problem, where you reduce the blast radius of stolen credentials and make unusual authentication events more visible and harder to approve casually. Another major category is malicious documents and attachments, which remain effective because documents are a normal part of work and because document viewers are complex software that has historically contained exploitable weaknesses. Attackers may deliver a file that looks like a legitimate invoice, a resume, a shipping notice, or a shared report, knowing that the recipient has a reason to open it. Sometimes the attack relies on persuading the user to enable risky features, and sometimes it relies on exploiting a vulnerability in how the application parses content. Even when modern platforms reduce certain legacy risks, attackers adjust by using different file types or by embedding links that lead to further exploitation. Leaders should anticipate that attachments can deliver malware, can install remote access tools, or can act as a staging step to steal tokens and credentials. A common misunderstanding is that scanning attachments once is enough, when in reality new threats emerge constantly and attachment scanning must be layered with user protections and endpoint controls. Another mistake is assuming only email attachments are risky, because files can arrive through chat tools, shared drives, and vendor portals. The leadership takeaway is that document handling is part of the threat surface, and you must apply consistent controls across all channels where files enter. Browsers deserve special attention because the browser is now the most common client application for business, and it acts as both a workspace and a gateway to cloud services. A browser loads code from many places, runs scripts, stores cookies and tokens, and interacts with sensitive data, often across multiple tabs and sessions. This makes browsers attractive to attackers because a successful browser-based compromise can lead directly to account takeover, data theft, and unauthorized actions performed in the user's context. Web-based attacks include malicious sites designed to exploit vulnerabilities, as well as attacks that abuse trust within legitimate sites. A classic example is cross-site scripting, XSS, where attacker-controlled script executes in a victim's browser because an application fails to properly handle untrusted input. The result can be session hijacking, data exfiltration, or tricking users into actions that appear legitimate. Another example is cross-site request forgery, CSRF, where a user's browser is manipulated into sending a request to a trusted site in a way the user did not intend, relying on existing authentication cookies. Leaders do not need to write code to understand these threats, but they must anticipate that browser sessions and tokens are high-value targets and that web application security directly influences client-side risk. Client-side attacks also include drive-by compromises, where the user does not intentionally download a suspicious file, yet still gets compromised simply by visiting a site or being redirected. These attacks rely on vulnerabilities in the browser, plugins, or underlying components, and they can be delivered through compromised legitimate sites, malicious advertising, or poisoned search results. The key point is that a user can be exposed during normal browsing, which is why patching and safe browser configurations matter so much. Leaders should anticipate that users will visit a wide range of sites for legitimate work, including vendor pages, documentation, and community resources, and that the organization cannot realistically whitelist only a handful of domains without crippling productivity. That means prevention must focus on reducing exposure and increasing resilience, such as using modern browser versions, disabling unnecessary plugins, and limiting risky execution paths. A beginner misconception is that the organization can simply tell users not to browse the internet, but modern work often requires browsing, and forcing workarounds creates shadow IT that is harder to protect. A realistic approach treats browsing as normal and defends the endpoint accordingly. Credential theft is another centerpiece of client-side attacks, because credentials are the keys that unlock systems, and attackers frequently use client compromise as a way to harvest those keys. Credential theft can happen through phishing, through malware that captures keystrokes, through token theft from a browser, or through stealing cache credentials from an operating system. Leaders should think beyond passwords, because modern systems use tokens, sessions, and single sign-on flows that can be stolen and reused. Single sign-on, SSO, reduces password sprawl and can improve security, but it also concentrates value in the identity provider session, which means a compromised client can become a powerful tool for the attacker. Another misconception is that password managers or strong passwords alone solve the problem, when in fact the client device still becomes the place where secrets are used and where sessions live. This is why endpoint protections, secure authentication flows, and careful session management all matter. Leaders should also anticipate that attackers will target privileged users, such as administrators and finance staff, because the payoff is higher. Protecting these roles may require additional controls that reduce session lifetime, enforce stronger verification, and limit what privileged accounts can do from general-purpose devices. Malware is an umbrella term that covers many client-side threats, and leaders must anticipate it not as a single event, but as a life cycle that can include delivery, execution, persistence, and command and control. Malware might arrive through a file, a link, a compromised update, or a malicious install disguised as a legitimate tool. Once executed, it might steal credentials, encrypt data for ransom, spy on activity, or open remote access. The client is a common target because it often has user permissions, access to business data, and connectivity to internal and cloud services. A beginner mistake is assuming malware is always noisy, like a visible pop-up, when modern malware often tries to remain quiet and blend into normal system activity. Leaders should anticipate that even a low-privilege infection can become dangerous if it captures tokens, waits for the user to log into valuable services, or uses the user's existing access to move deeper. This is why endpoint detection and response, EDR, matters, because it focuses on detecting suspicious behaviors and responding quickly, not just blocking known signatures. However, leaders should also remember that EDR is not a substitute for hardening, because relying solely on detection creates risk if detection fails or response is delayed. Software updates and supply chain risks deserve attention because client-side compromise can happen through trusted channels if an attacker can influence what software gets installed or updated. People tend to trust updates, and systems often run them automatically, which makes the update pipeline a powerful target. A compromised software package, a malicious browser extension, or a Trojanized installer can spread quickly across many endpoints because it looks legitimate. Leaders should anticipate that users will install extensions and helper tools to increase productivity, and those add-ons can request broad permissions that effectively grant them access to browsing data, session tokens, and page content. Browser extensions in particular can be an underappreciated risk because they can observe and modify what a user sees in the browser, which can enable credential theft and data leakage. A practical defense posture includes controlling what can be installed, monitoring for unauthorized software, and ensuring updates come from trusted sources. But it also includes acknowledging that overly restrictive controls can trigger workarounds. The leadership challenge is to design a safe path for needed tools while preventing uncontrolled expansion of executable code on endpoints. Another client-side failure point leaders must anticipate is misconfiguration and overpermission on endpoints, because even without a sophisticated attacker, weak defaults can create easy openings. If users have local administrative rights everywhere, malware can install more easily and persist more reliably. If macros or risky scripting features are enabled broadly, a single document can become an execution platform. If endpoint firewalls are disabled, lateral movement becomes easier once a device is compromised. If devices are not encrypted, lost hardware becomes a data breach rather than a minor inconvenience. These are not glamorous issues, but they are foundational, and attackers love foundational weaknesses because they reduce effort. Leaders should treat endpoint configuration as a baseline problem, meaning there should be an expected minimum secure state that is applied consistently and checked continuously. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking endpoint security is about telling users to be careful, when many of the most effective protections are silent defaults that users never have to think about. When endpoints are hardened, users can still make mistakes, but the mistakes are less likely to become catastrophic. That is a core leadership goal: reduce the blast radius of normal human error. Client-side attacks also include data exposure through everyday behavior, such as copying sensitive data into the wrong place, sharing files widely, or storing credentials in unsafe locations. These events are sometimes called accidental breaches, but from an impact perspective, they can be just as damaging as deliberate theft. Leaders must anticipate that people will take shortcuts when they feel blocked, such as emailing files to themselves, using personal storage, or pasting sensitive details into chat threads. This is why data handling policies must be paired with usable tools and clear guidance, because policy alone does not prevent improvisation. Data loss prevention, DLP, can help by detecting and blocking certain risky transfers, but it must be tuned carefully so it supports work rather than constantly interrupting it. Another misconception is that only technical teams cause these exposures, when in reality, any role that handles customer information, financial details, or internal strategy can accidentally leak data. The prevention focus should be on minimizing what data is collected, limiting who can access it, and providing safe default storage and sharing mechanisms. When safe options are easy, risky workarounds become less attractive. Leaders also need to anticipate how client-side compromise becomes a stepping stone to broader compromise, because the first infected device is often not the final target. Attackers commonly use a compromised client to steal credentials, access email, and then impersonate the user to reach other people, escalating trust and expanding access. From there, they may seek privileged accounts, sensitive data repositories, or financial systems. This is why client-side attacks cannot be treated as isolated endpoint problems. They are entry points into business processes. A leader should view client-side protections as part of an attack path interruption strategy, where you break the chain at multiple points. You reduce the chance of initial compromise with training and filtering. You reduce the chance of execution with hardening and application controls. You reduce the chance of persistence and stealth with monitoring. And you reduce the chance of escalation with least privilege and strong identity controls. A beginner might think that preventing every click is the goal, but a more resilient goal is to assume some clicks will happen and ensure the consequences are limited and detectable. When you design for interruption, you stop betting everything on a single control. Detection and response on the client side matter because no prevention layer is perfect, and leaders must anticipate that some attacks will slip through. The key is to shorten the time between compromise and containment, because time is what turns an incident into a disaster. Client-side detection relies on signals such as unusual process behavior, suspicious network connections, unexpected credential access, and anomalies in authentication events. A strong response capability includes isolating a device, revoking sessions, resetting credentials, and investigating what the attacker touched. Leaders should also anticipate that incident response on endpoints can be disruptive, so the organization needs a plan for how work continues when a device is quarantined. This operational planning is often neglected, yet it influences whether teams will cooperate quickly during a response. Another misconception is that response is purely technical, when it also includes communication, decision-making, and coordination across teams like IT, security, and affected business units. When leaders build a response playbook that includes client-side incidents, they reduce chaos and increase confidence, which leads to faster action when warning signs appear. A fast, calm response is one of the best defenses against evolving client-side threats. A mature leadership approach also recognizes that client-side risk is influenced by device diversity and workforce patterns, because remote work, personal devices, and third-party access can expand the client boundary. Bring your own device, BYOD, models can increase convenience, but often reduce control if devices are not managed consistently. Contractors and vendors may access systems from devices outside the organization's standard baseline, which can create uneven risk. Leaders must anticipate that the organization may not fully control every endpoint that touches critical data, and they must design access policies that reflect that reality. This can include stronger authentication, conditional access, segmentation of sensitive resources, and limiting what can be downloaded or stored locally. The point is not to block all external work, but to adapt controls so the riskiest actions require the most assurance. Beginners sometimes assume the answer is to forbid anything uncontrolled, but rigid bans often create shadow work that is even less safe. A better path is to provide approved, managed options for common needs and to apply stronger safeguards when the device posture is unknown. This is how leadership balances productivity and protection in the client-side threat landscape. As we close, recognizing client-side attacks is fundamentally about understanding where modern work is vulnerable and why attackers keep choosing the user's device as the entry point. Client-side attacks include phishing and impersonation, malicious documents, browser-based exploitation, credential and token theft, malware, risky extensions, and misconfigurations that turn simple mistakes into major compromise. Leaders must anticipate these threats not by memorizing every technique, but by understanding the attack paths and designing layered protections that interrupt those paths at multiple points. The most effective strategies combine strong identity protections, hardened endpoint baselines, safe software and update practices, usable data handling controls, and detection and response capabilities that act quickly when something slips through. When these pieces work together, the organization becomes resilient, meaning a single click or a single compromised device is far less likely to become a full-scale incident. That resilience is what leadership should aim for, because client-side attacks will keep evolving, but disciplined design and consistent controls can keep the impact contained and the recovery fast.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.